welcome everybody to the transport infrastructure stream of the MENA PPP virtual think tank. We're into the afternoon series of streams. We have 3 parallel streams running, one on power and water, one on social infrastructure, and this one on transport. And if you use the sessions icon on the left-hand side of your screen, you can jump between the 3 sessions. I hear a bit of feedback. If the panelists, if you can hear me, if you could turn your microphones on mute, please. Okay, transport infrastructure section. We have a fantastic panel to discuss transport infrastructure using PPP, and it's a very important topic because whilst PPP has been successfully implemented in the electricity and water sector, and we're starting to see it in some areas of social infrastructure around schools and housing, transport has been more problematic, and we've had talks of rail. Mainline rail projects using PPP across Saudi Arabia, or metro systems using PPP. We've had some successes in the airport terminal operations side and in the ports terminal operations side. So it's a sort of mixed story, but it's absolutely core to the PPP agenda moving forward to find new ways of financing and delivering this key logistics and transportation infrastructure. And so the purpose of this panel today is to talk about the opportunities for public-private partnerships and variants of public-private partnerships in the transportation and logistics sector, and some of the challenges and the ways forward. We have a fantastic panel for you today. We have Munir Ferozi, who is the regional head for PPP privatization and infrastructure financial advisory for the MENA region for IFC. We have engineer Loy Ghazali, who is the portfolio advisor for major infrastructure and PPP at the Ministry of Works in Bahrain. Engineer Loy has not joined us on the line yet. We're in contact with him and we expect him to join us any moment now. We have Trevor Butcher, who is a partner and head of Middle East Energy and Infrastructure for DLA Piper, the international law firm. And we have Morgan Belsher, who is the IDE practice lead and principal technical advisor for MacDonald. Morgan, just quickly, what is IDE?
It captures infrastructure development and economics.
Excellent, thank you very much. So infrastructure development and economics practice lead at MacDonald, one of the world's great engineering and multidisciplinary consultants. So fantastic panel. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. I'm going to go around the panelists first for a few opening comments. If you have questions for the panelists, please send them to me and the panelists using the tab on the right-hand side, and I will field your questions or your comments to the panelists to help the discussion along. So, Munir, I want to come to you first. So you're the regional head for PPP privatization and infrastructure financial advisory for IFC covering this region. Where do you see transport PPP in this picture? We've talked about the importance of PPP, and I just mentioned some of the challenges. How well positioned is the region's transportation sector to lever PPP for these key projects?
Thanks a lot, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Look, before I answer your question, a little bit about IFC and myself. So, as you said, I cover the IFC's infrastructure and PPP advisory practice. We act as sell-side advisors to the governments, and we've been engaged in quite a few landmark transport deals, which I want to talk about. So, I think the question that you pose is a very relevant one, and a lot of discussion has taken place this morning in terms of MENA region's stellar track record in the water and power sector, but not so stellar track record on, and actually I would say disappointing track record in the transport sector, where we talk about land bridge, we talk about Makhraf Goefat, we talk about Subia crossing. We have not seen projects proceed, but we have seen a track record of projects that have been successful, right? We've been engaged in some of the landmark deals. As I said, Queen Alia comes to my mind. Back in 2007-8, the first airport PPP in the Middle East and North Africa region, followed by Medina Airport, and in between we did the Hajj terminal as well. Today, we are advising on a number of other projects, such as the King Hussein Bridge Crossing, which was talked about this morning. We are also advising, or we were advising until the economic crisis happened in Lebanon, the Beirut Airport project, and we have a number of other portfolio projects. But needless to say that this is a difficult project, this is a difficult sector for the region, and there are reasons behind it. I'll come to that in a minute. But it is a possible sector, and it has been proven that it can be successful. Now, where do I see opportunities? I think we have done quite a bit of power in this region. If we talk about the large countries, we talked about Egypt today, we talked about Jordan, we talked about Morocco. They have done a number of power deals, and I think they are now reaching long on the power sector. So that, for me, that's an opportunity in terms of looking at transport. And despite the COVID situation, I would say that the airport opportunities are going to be there in this region, starting with Saudi Arabia and moving across the region. If you look at the state of airports outside of GCC, and even in GCC, right, there's a lot of upgrading and rehabilitation required. And that's a sector that private investors understand, right, because it's a banked sector. Moving more into the
Amir,
roads.
if I can just interrupt, sorry to interrupt you when you're just giving your summary comments, but on the aviation side, there's obviously been this huge dislocation caused by the COVID pandemic. So I'm just responding to that first point that you made. Have the economics been fundamentally altered for that sector? Because that was one of the kind of key areas of transport for PPP, and now it's really being challenged.
So I think in the short run, yes. I think in the long run, if you look, because PPPs are long-term projects in the 25, 30-year time period, I would say that demand will come back. How it comes back and when it comes back is something that we are struggling with in terms of projecting demand. But looking at the sector, we do see opportunities. Saudi Arabia needs to build 9 new airports, right? They need to rehabilitate their current airports. You take the example of Medina Airport versus what has been done on Jeddah Airport, right? Where Jeddah has spent a lot of money, but we have a very successful track record on the Medina Airport. So I see this sector coming back. I think this is a sector which the private investors understand, the banks understand, right? And whilst we will have a short-term dip in the activity on the aviation side, and there will be sort of tighter credit structures around them, not the ones that we've been used to, but I feel that there will be opportunities as well. Then on the urban transport side, looking at 3 out of 8 cities in the MENA region are over 3 million people, right? We need to solve the transport problem, whether it is by virtue of metros. I would say more BRTs than metros because of the cost and the fiscal stress. You cannot really afford the metros. And then I think on the ports sector, I see opportunities as well in terms of both monetization as well as rehabilitation. And yeah, so that's really what I see. Now, in terms of markets, Saudi, obviously, we talked about quite a large market. I would expect transport deals coming out of that. I think if you move outside of GCC, you should see deals out of Egypt, out of Jordan, Morocco, and Iraq is a big unknown, right? And you need to do everything in Iraq, including power, and transport will be also a key sector over there.
It's my perception, and this could be wrong, but with the transport PPPs, sometimes the ambition has been bigger than the capacity. So, you mentioned the Mafraq-Guefat highway, and you mentioned the land bridge in Saudi and the Sevilla crossing in Kuwait. Is it the fact that the civil engineering, the construction risk is too big for these transport projects, or is it the commercial model? There's no track record, there's no sovereign sort of guaranteed income. What is it that makes? Why aren't these working? Or in the past, why haven't?
Oh, that's a great question, Richard. I think I have one technical answer and one soft answer. So let me start with the soft answer there. I think transport projects are what people can feel versus the energy projects. So there's a tendency to overspec them. There's a tendency to have the best looking airport, the best looking metro, the best looking road, or the most wide road in the region, rather than looking at what the demand can support, right? That's one thing. So that's the soft side. The technical side also is, the risk allocation, the capacity to understand how a project is prepared has not been there compared to the energy sector. I think it's a work in progress. We will get there, but we need to start preparing the projects properly. We need to make sure that the risk is allocated. The demand risk in an untested market, whereby people are asked, or private sector are asked to take a tolling risk on a completely greenfield airport, is not going to work, right? You need to somehow incentivize them through some payment structure, such as availability payment. And then over time, you can probably, dilute the risk a little bit as well, right? But to start with, you need to build a track record. And I think this is a very predominantly public sector dominant region, right? And there's a tendency particularly of not letting go of these projects in terms of, these are your crown jewels, right? Particularly on the airport side, right? Whereby you want to build the most attractive airport, rather than looking at what can be served in terms of the service levels. So for me, these are 2 or 3 sectors. I think political willingness and commitment, ability to appropriate risks appropriately to the right party, project preparation, and then building capacity. And of course, since Trevor is there, let me not forget the legal and regulatory framework.
Well, I was going to come on to Trevor with those questions in just a second. Just one final point for you, or question for you, Munir. So we heard engineer Attar Hanura this morning from the PPP Central Unit in Egypt talking about dry ports for PPPs in Egypt, and that kind of logistical element. And you yourself just talked about Medina Terminal and the Jeddah Hajj Terminal as well. It seems to me that it's working quite well. PPP is working quite well where it's a logistics hub, a facility where there's a throughput. It's the bit in between that seems to struggle, the moving parts. Is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you need to have an open mind in terms of structuring and what makes sense. I don't think that logistics makes it easier per se. So when I was advising on the Medina airport, the first thing that was asked by the private investors and the lenders, right, because they were used to the energy project, was we want to make sure that there is a demand risk coverage, right? We need to make sure that there is a minimum demand risk that the government takes. And we said no, right? And we pushed the market in that direction. So the demand risk is borne by the private investor because you can demonstrate that by virtue of a traffic. Remember, it was a brownfield airport as well. A lot of transport projects that you're talking about are greenfield with no demand proven in terms of what this can do. But I think over years you can move that risk much more.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, if I can come to you, Trevor. You are the head of Middle East Energy and Infrastructure Group at DLA Piper, one of the biggest law firms in the world. And if you could take a moment to sort of tell us about the work you've done on the transport PPP sector in the region. But I'm quite interested to know, from a lawyer's perspective, is there something different that you need to think about when you're setting up a transport project compared to, say, a hospital or a school or some other project? What are the characteristics that clients need to think when they're trying to set up a transport PPP? But maybe tell us a bit about your work as well, the work that DLA Piper has done.
Thanks, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. Obviously there haven't been a huge number of PPPs in the transport sector across the region, but we have been involved in a lot of the conventionally procured projects, as well as some of the PPPs that are being done at the moment. So we're advising at the moment on the Bahrain Metro project, advising the MTT in Bahrain on that. We're also heavily involved in projects such as the O&M tenders for Dubai Metro and Tram at the moment. So we're active across the region, although, like everyone else, the baseload of our work has been in the power and the water sector until now. My own background has been, before I came to the Middle East about 7 years ago, it was predominantly in the transport sector. So I've advised on many sort of road and rail projects, some airport projects, probably about 20 plus deals that have got to financial close. So I'm very keen to sort of see the sector flourish here. And I think just picking up on sort of a couple of general themes before I sort of respond to your specific question. I think that the thing that is lacking around the region is a large dose of realism. I think people need to be much more realistic about a number of things, including risk transfer, which Munir has already touched on, and that is a factor, I think, that is quite specific to the transport sector. I worked on the DBFO roads sector in the UK back in the 1990s, and there was a really fascinating transition there from the first deals, which were done as shadow tolls with 100% usage risk, demand risk being taken by the private sector. They moved through deals that were structured as 70% demand risk and 30% availability. Then they moved to 30% availability and 70%, 70% availability, 30% demand, and ultimately to 90% availability and 10% demand. And then finally, they decided on value for money grounds that it was better not to be seeking to transfer demand risk. I don't say that because I believe that transferring no demand risk is the right answer, but it does just kind of demonstrate that that it's a spectrum and that there's an infinite number of points along that spectrum in terms of how much demand risk you should be looking to transfer, and that will vary enormously from project to project. And I think being realistic about that, being realistic about where the non-fare box revenues are coming from on these schemes, being realistic about what the TOD developments can contribute to these projects and where the risk of those can lie is absolutely critical. But the other bit of realism is around the preparation of projects, and getting them market ready does require an awful lot. And we've touched this morning already on the need for PPP laws, and I do endorse that. I agree that those are helpful and beneficial, but you only have to look at markets like Kuwait, where they've had very good PPP laws for a very long time, but not necessarily been able to develop the market. So it's only part of the picture, I think. The other point is just in terms of the sort of broader regulatory picture, and I think there that again, it does vary enormously from sector to sector. And if you look at the rail sector, for example, what you need to do in terms of getting rail regulation ready and fully established, the regulatory regime fully established before you go to market, even on a standalone project like a metro or a light rail project, again, is critical, because the deals are not going to work unless you've got that regime established. So there's both the PPP readiness in terms of the regulation, and also the sort of sector-specific regulation that needs to be done. And just touching on the experience, the recent experience on Bahrain, the MTT had done an awful lot of work, in terms of preparing, excellent work in terms of preparing that project before the advisors became involved. But nevertheless, it remains a long path to sort of explore all of those commercial and regulatory regimes, and to get the deal ready before it is properly ready to issue an RFP to the market.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. Now, I was making notes as you were speaking that I wanted to follow up on. I now have about 6 questions I want to follow up with you on. So I'll ask 1 or 2 now, but then we'll come back to the others later. I'm interested that you talked about the experiences in other markets, the UK specifically, in transport, in advance of this region. Are the challenges facing transport PPPs in this market basically the same as what the UK and other countries went through, or is there something different here that has made it more challenging in this market?
I think fundamentally the challenges are probably the same. Obviously in each place the regulatory regime and the specifics of any project are different, but fundamentally the issues are the same. So I think that it's partly around the point that Mia made earlier and the point that was made this morning around people truly embracing the PPP mentality, people understanding that there's a degree of control that needs to be ceded if you are going to go down a PPP path, and you have to look at it as a partnership that is going to endure for 25, 30 more years. And I think that it's that mentality that perhaps has been missing here in the region, and also the tendency to over-specify, whether it's a road or an airport. Yes, it needs to be attractive, but also it needs to be functional and economically viable. And that, as I say, I think it's that realism, that sort of true adoption of the PPP partnership mentality that still needs to be developed.
Okay, thank you. Now, I have other questions that I want to come back to you with, Trevor, around the risk allocation points that you mentioned, but I want to come to Morgan Belsher now. So Morgan Belsher, you're I'm going to get this wrong. I can't remember what the IDE stands for. It was Infrastructure, Design and Economy. Was that right?
Development and Economics, yeah.
Infrastructure Development and Economics Practice Lead, Principal Technical Advisor at Mott, MacDonald, one of the biggest multidisciplinary consultancies in the world. Trevor's point just now, I was going to ask you about this over-specking, or this idea of grand, transport solutions. I guess this is where MacDonald and others are involved. That technical spec. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit first about the work that you've done, MacDonald, in the region on the transport PPP, and then maybe a comment on Trevor's point about that the sort of realism that's required, or perhaps you disagree with that point.
Sure. So thanks. I did miss most of Trevor's. Unfortunately, the system kicked me out, but I can respond to that point, no issue. Yeah, I mean, Mott MacDonald and our advisory practice, and specifically, as you say, the IDE focus is much like MEED. We're providing a lot of government-side transaction advisory support across the region. We're very privileged to be working with NCP, who were obviously on earlier, ADIO, the Ashgal, the Public Works Authority in Qatar, as well as PAP in Oman, supporting them through their kind of initial stages of developing their capability. But yeah, so we're working on a range of projects, predominantly in social infra, but also we've worked historically on a number of the transport projects that have been mentioned. Medina, for example, we've been involved in Mafraq. We were the technical advisors on the Mafraq-Rafah highway. So yeah, great pedigree, supported obviously by our global business, across the world. In terms of the overspecking, yeah, and I think this is a big mindset change for regional governments. It's moving from an input-based specification to an output-based specification. That's you're basically asking for a functionality of an asset or an asset class, not specifying how it looks, etc., etc. You want for example, in a school, you want a classroom to be available 9 hours a day at a certain temperature with ambient lights, settings, etc. You don't specify how that should be done. That's where the private sector expertise is coming in. That's what you're asking for, and that's what.
So if I can just clarify that point, are you saying that currently, or what has been done in the past, is the second point, the specifying a specific size of building or capacity of road, and not what you're recommending, the kind of output-based approach? So what you're saying is, in the past we've not been doing it correctly. Is that, if I picked that up correctly?
Yeah, but it's just the fundamental feature of PPP is to try and turn to an output-based specification. So you're moving away from a ministry specifying, and Mafraq's a brilliant example. The government clients went to Australia. They saw high road standards in Australia, and they brought those high road standards back and tried to implement it on Mafraq. But there were Australian dynamics within that road. There was a flood relief system, for example, which you just would never need, or at least not most of the year, for a road in a desert. So there was a classic example of a huge overspecking that just wasn't needed. But again, coming back to Munir's point, because certain clients had seen that in Australia, they wanted those gold-plated standards in Abu Dhabi, which just wasn't needed, frankly. So that's one of the challenges as transaction advisors of trying to move governments away from that input-based specification. And it is a loss of control in a sense. You no longer have the ability.
So the problem in that overspecking scenario is that basically you put up the commercial risk or the construction risk to the developer, which makes the model, undermines the commercial model. That's the point.
Correct, yeah. Yeah, you just build, and when you do your affordability analysis, your value for money, the project falls over because you're not sticking to the kind of the fundamentals, as I say, of PPP, which is bringing that private sector expertise into bringing international best practice to deliver those outputs in the most efficient manner. And
so from, I'm guessing that Mott MacDonald, as a technical consultant, that's your job to sort of, obviously if the client gives you the brief, you fulfill the brief, but you provide that kind of, recommendation to focus on a particular philosophy. Are you seeing a change of mindset? So as the region has matured in terms of its awareness of PPP, particularly on the transport side, is there a change of mindset? Is there more realism creeping in?
Yeah, I think there is, and something that's come through this whole conference this morning, Ziad mentioned it in his opening address, is this kind of momentum that's building around a maturity in the market now. Clients are becoming more mature. They're letting go. Advisors, us included, are becoming more mature, providing better advice to bespoke bespoke problems in region. So yeah, no, I definitely think there is a move towards that. There are still challenges, and it's sector to sector, country to country. We see a different variety across all of those.
I mean, I don't know if you saw it from the interview with Mohammed Al Daheri, the head of infrastructure projects at the Abu Dhabi Investment Office. He talks about setting up output-based PPPs, which I presume is the same thing that you're just talking about now. Is that, I mean, is he basically saying the same words that maybe, the PTT in Kuwait 10 years ago was saying, or is that an evolution? Are we seeing a kind of, different language being used by the sponsoring organizations?
Yeah, 100%. A different approach from the sponsoring organizations, supported now by a robust framework. Both in Abu Dhabi and in Saudi, for example, there is now a robust framework for walking these projects from inception through the business case, through procurement, and to financial close. So there's no longer this ability, for different stakeholders to get involved as there was in the past. This is now, a well-trodden path, and it's, as I say, it's this momentum is building. And it's generating great excitement both in the investor market as well as a local government level. Other government ministries now want to be involved in developing the projects they've been unable to for years, for example. So yeah, it's a good time.
Well, thank you very much for that, Morgan. So we're still waiting for Loy Ghazali from the infrastructure and PPP units at the Ministry of Works in Bahrain. I know that my colleagues are trying to get him into the conversation, and as soon as he's able to join us, I will bring him in. In the meantime, we will carry on, and if you have questions for Trevor, for Munir, or for Morgan, please send them in using the tabs on the right-hand side. It's great to hear engagement and questions and comments from the audience. Presumably that is why you have joined today's event. Munir, if I can come back to you then. So, we've heard from Trevor sort of his comments about, from a lawyer's perspective, about the risk allocation, and Morgan talking there about the setup of a project, from the spec. From your point of view as a financier, obviously the IFC is slightly different to a sort of a regular bank, at least in my head it is. Do you have any say in that, or does somebody just bring a project to you and say, can you finance this, or do you have the ability to help shape the specifications of a project?
Thanks, Richard. So first of all, I cover the advisory business, so I think I have the ability to influence in terms of structuring of these projects, and that's what we've tried to do. In a number of projects, we've de-spec'd them, and really talking about what Trevor said in terms of putting the reality check back into the government in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, right? So that's on the advisory side. I think your question is more related to, do we have any influence on the financing side, right? I think we look at it in terms of, can the project support, project cash flow support the capex, right? Essentially, that's the number crunching we do, right? So from that perspective, if it doesn't stand up, then we don't finance like any other bank would. Of course, we do have the development mandate, so we go into the markets where traditional commercial banks do not operate, or we are sort of on the long end of the market, whereby we are extending the tenors, right? But in terms of an over-spec project being financed by IFC, I think we will not do that because it has the cash flows and need to stand behind the project. I mean,
have you ever seen that where a project is brought to you and you can see the social and economic benefits, but you think that it's been set up incorrectly, was over specified, and you'll say no, we're not going to get involved because of that reason?
Richard, I think we come back to a very fundamental issue in terms of what we talked about in terms of project preparation. If the project is prepared well, irrespective of who the advisor is, right, then we will not have these subsequent issues in terms of financing, right? Of course, we operate on the margin whereby the social and economic benefits are balanced by the commercial returns, right? So we can tweak things, but if it's fundamentally wrong, I don't think that project will be able to be financed.
Now, if I can ask you one question, Munir, and this may be off topic, and you can slap me down if it's missing the point, but I'm interested in the role of export credit, or I'm particularly thinking of China here. So the Belt and Road Initiative, this huge $60 trillion pot of money to finance largely transport and logistics infrastructure.
They can see me now. Now they can see me. All right.
Is that Loy?
Yes. I was in all the time. I was in all the time, but somehow you couldn't see me.
I wasn't able to see. I can see you now. If you can just give me a couple of minutes, I just want to put a question to Munir, and then I'm going to come to you to ask about Bahrain. So 30 seconds to finish the question with Munir. So Munir, and I think you can put the mic on mute, so I can hear a lot of background noise at the moment. So Munir, the Belt and Roads Initiative, it's about, the Chinese want to fund transport logistics corridors. So where does export credit fit into PPP? Does that take it out of this conversation and that becomes something else? Or do you see that, and particularly China, being significant in this sector?
This question is for me?
Sorry, Loy, this is for Munir Ferozi. I'll come to you in one moment.
Look, I'll be quick on this one. I think, the way I look at ECAs or sort of the China Exim back and all that, it's another source of financing. I think the requirements are so huge that neither commercial banks nor development financial institutions can fulfill them on their own. So for me, it's just another source of financing, and you've seen them used in some of the deals in the region, right? And I think that's true for Islamic financing as well, right? You've seen the Islamic financing tranche being used as well in terms of PPPs. So PPPs, by their very nature, can accommodate different sources of financing, right? Even Islamic financing, we can have a Sharia compliant structure built on a PPP. Medina is a classic case whereby there is Islamic tranche in that as well. So to answer your question, can the ECAs or the Exim banks support the PPPs? Absolutely, right? And eventually what I'd like to see, we've seen some examples in the region, but the pension funds and the bonds investing once the construction risk is over.
Okay, thank you. I mean, what was in my mind was really, does the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative help change the dynamic for transport PPPs in the Middle East? I guess what you're saying is potentially it could. It doesn't rule it out. Okay, thank you. Loy, if I can come to you, thank you very much for your perseverance. I'm so sorry that you couldn't hear me before. You weren't appearing on my screen. So Engineer Loy Ghazali, you are the portfolio advisor for major infrastructure and PPP at the Ministry of Works in Bahrain. So thank you very much for joining us. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your program at the Ministry of Works, your PPP program in Bahrain at the moment? What is the current situation? And maybe a little bit about the pipeline of future PPP projects.
We had extensive public-private partnership pipeline in Bahrain. However, due to the COVID-19, we started rethinking some of the projects that we had, especially in the transport sector. This is a situation where delivery of some project is uncertain, and the revenues also is uncertain on the other side. So many projects' feasibilities got affected, and the government had to do extensive support for its citizens because of the crisis, and that caused budget stress, in addition to the already stressed budget of the Kingdom of Bahrain. So at this moment, many of the projects are back to the drawing board to build sustainability in them and to prioritize many of them. So our approach to public-private partnership have changed due to the COVID-19. We're building more sustainability in these projects, and we're definitely trying to phase some of them if they can be phased, or to scale down others if they can be scaled down. The sector that was affected the most is the transport sector. Probably 2 or 3 projects are being rethought at the moment. On the other hand, many other projects are being accelerated. For example, sewage treatment projects are being accelerated. We discovered due to the COVID-19, like sewage flow increased by like 20% because people are staying at home and consuming more water. So sewage treatment plants are being accelerated. Transport projects are being slowed down a bit. And on the other hand, IT projects are pushing forward, fast forward. Nearly 70% of the government staff are working from home, and this put enormous pressure on our IT system. So technology IT projects are pushing forward. Demand-related projects are being slowed down. Projects with questions on delivery are being mitigated, especially the ones that depend on equipment import from outside Bahrain. Electromechanical components, delivery chains are disrupted because of the corona, and so is delivery schedules for many equipment dependent projects. In the future, we have to continue to monitor whether this crisis will be short term or medium term. Many people expect it will not be long term because the world could recover and have a vaccine. So in the short to medium term, we are continually monitoring, and we're being very cautious in terms of the budgetary expenditures. We expend money as needed, especially many projects are in the distressed zone now, where the government is expected to provide more money injections to these public-private partnership projects.
Thank you very much for that. That's a very clear and frank explanation of the situation in Bahrain. If I can just focus a little bit on the transport projects that you mentioned. So the primary purpose of this panel is the transport infrastructure. Now, in Bahrain, you had some huge plans around transport, the new airport, the causeway, the metro, and some road projects, and to use PPP of some form for those. When you say they're being back to the drawing board, does that mean postponed or cancelled, or does it mean reduced in scope and restructured in phases? What does back to the drawing board mean for those critical projects?
Many of what you said. Number one, before the COVID-19, these projects were competing with one another. For example, the Bahrain North Link Road was competing with the light rail transit road. causeway expansion, which Saudi Arabia was competing with another railway coming up from Saudi Arabia. The airport expansion also was, in a way, it was competing with the different modes of transport that we had. So now we're developing a transport strategy for Bahrain where projects are not competing with one another. Exactly. And for example, because we have huge demand uncertainty now, and financing will be difficult to do all these projects at a time. So we're trying to reduce scope, as you said, at the same time to phase some of them. Instead of executing a full 6-lane highway, we will try to do phase 1, a 3-lane highway, and do the second 3-lane in the future. So many of these projects are being re-examined and the feasibility checked and checked again to make sure the government pays least availability payment, because these projects will be executed on availability-based system due to demand uncertainty. So the government wants to reduce its availability payment to its lowest value. They're canceled, not canceled. I wouldn't say canceled, but I would say phased, depending on the short-term outlook of the demand situation in Bahrain. Especially there is no tolling in Bahrain. Tolling in Bahrain have not been tested. People capacity to pay tolling have not been tested. People willingness to pay tolling have not been tested. So on uncertain grounds with transport project, and this is why we're approaching this endeavor with caution.
Okay, and now if I understood what you said correctly, it sounds like there is a sort of transport master plan being worked on at the moment. And one of the comments that came this morning in the plenary session for this PPP conference was the importance of having a pipeline of projects. So if you want to attract private developers into a market, they like to see a pipeline. So will this transport plan that you are currently working on, do you anticipate that this will produce some kind of pipeline of transport PPPs?
Definitely. It's not a newly thought of master plan. It's more like phasing the different transport projects that we had. Instead of doing all of them at the same time, like we originally planned, now we're putting them through a pipeline. We're on priority-based basis. The government focus is on securing financing for these projects. And if there is demand uncertainty, if they're competing with one another, the risk allocation will be asymmetrical, and not so many investors would want to come on board. So our transport strategy is more of a phasing strategy in terms of our new priorities, but they will all be executed at one point in time.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you very much, Lloyd. I will come back in a moment. We have a number of questions that have come in from the audience. I just want to put some of these to the panelists. If I can just read the questions. So, right, okay, so I don't know who to put this one to, but perhaps Munir, if I come to you, this is a question. It says, the discussion on PPP projects have been going on for years for rail, Mecca Metro, Abu Dhabi Metro, Land Bridge. Are we going to see any implementation? So maybe a slightly unfair question to you, Munir, because obviously different situations in different countries. But do you see rail having a future in PPP?
So look, I think, how should I answer? This is a difficult one to answer, but let me make an attempt at it. We are in a very fiscally stressed situation right now. So the projects are going to be phased, they're going to be delayed and all that. But I think the way I look at it, is there a need for these projects, right? And if the answer to that is yes, then these projects will happen. They will not happen on the public balance sheet, more so now than before, right? Now, if you ask me when are they going to happen, I don't know the answer. I think the rail projects certainly are very large and complicated projects. They will probably be at the long end of the delivery and implementation. Some of the shorter delivery implementation projects would be the airports, as I said, because you have a demonstrated traffic on some of them, and you can monetize them better because the appetite is there, and the lenders can finance that, right? I think for me, for these projects to really see the light of the day, I think I just go back to 3 or 4 things that we've been talking about. Adequate project preparation, ability for the government to basically allocate the risks properly, making sure that the private sector is incentivized to come in, right? And then also providing them a stable and legal and regulatory framework. I think rail projects particularly, because they are a transport chain, right? The whole network needs to be in place. 2 things that we haven't talked about, which are very important, not necessarily for transport, but across the PPP space, is the need to make sure that you have a very transparent procurement process, right? Because some of these larger projects and the transport projects are on the larger side. People will be spending $2, $3, $5 million preparing these projects. So if you don't do this transparent procurement and there is a concern over that, you will not see people bidding for these projects. So that's very, very important to do that. And I think the second thing I would like to make a point on is, irrespective of what you do in the contracts, there will be hiccups along the way, right? It's a 25, 30-year project. So you need to really have a partnership mindset, right? To make sure that, if something happens, and COVID is a classic example, right? I mean, it's a force majeure, who is at fault? Nobody knows, right? Are we really working in a partnership mode whereby the government is basically seeing eye to eye with the private sector, not really putting them on the spot in terms of contractual provisions? So let me stop there. I don't know whether I answered your question or not, Richard.
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. I mean, it wasn't my question. I was merely the messenger of a submitted question. If the person who submitted that question, if we haven't answered it, please resubmit or refine your question. There's another one here. I want to come to Trevor and Morgan on this question. It's about skills and capacity. So the question is, as the market moves to output-based delivery, putting more onus on the advisor, what is the talent outlook in terms of hiring and training? Perhaps if I can come to you, Trevor, first, and then Morgan, I'll come to next. What's your thoughts, Trevor, on sort of local capacity, your own plans around hiring and training and changing skill requirements?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one. I mean, we talked already about the advisory capacity, and I think the point was made this morning that amongst the advisors, there is a high degree of capacity and capability already available within region to do that. I think the broader, more interesting question is about building up the skills within the local markets. And we're seeing a lot of requirements in terms of local content, training of local population, and other things across the region. And Saudi, in particular, is doing a lot of that, and within its projects is imposing a lot of local content requirements and a lot of requirements to train and employ specific numbers of staff. That's obviously a dynamic that differs across the region. Depending on the local population and the availability of the resource to do those things. But fundamentally, there is a gap. I think that the people in this region are now understanding that the solution to that is probably not continuously relying on expat resources that are brought in to do with it, but about training the local population. And the one thing I'd say is that needs to be a gradual and a managed process rather than a shock to the system. So certain markets like Oman seem to do that very well in that the localization and Omanization seems to happen much more gradually and in a much more managed way. So I think there is a requirement for more capacity building amongst across the region for these projects, and just urging caution, I guess, in terms of the way that it's implemented.
Okay, thank you. And Morgan, from the engineering and technical side, You know, what are the sort of outlook for capacity requirements in the context of PPP and the conversations we're having here?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, the market looks very strong, both from kind of government advisory side, where MacDonald traditionally are playing. You know, finding the right recruits is difficult at times, but you know, we recruit globally. I think also there is a requirement to develop the sort of the lead developer side, and that sort of engineering support as a number of these projects come to market. That, you know, understanding that bidding process, how to get that winning bid in, how to get that bid over the line for commercial close, financial close, and then build and operate the asset. I think as well for local governments, there's a real mindset shift from being owner-operator to now being in more of a contract management role as these projects move forward. And I know there is there's some skepticism or some concern in the developer market about how these new government bodies will act as the new kind of contract manager rather than the owner-operator that they've always taken. So that there is a, you know, a requirement for more sort of contract management skills to as I say, to manage and operate these contracts as they're rolled out.
Okay, thank you. Loy, if I can come back to you in Bahrain, I'm interested in the transport master plan that you're talking about, or the rephasing. Of this conversation, and earlier today, the conversation has been about greenfield projects. We're building new infrastructure on a PPP basis. In Bahrain, with the, you know, you've already mentioned the sort of the financial constraints. Is there also an agenda to outsource existing infrastructure to PPP? You know, so if you have a road or a causeway or an airport or a terminal that's already built, and you just need the operations and maintenance outsourced, that part of the agenda as well.
In transport, we don't yet have anything on public-private partnerships. Most Arab countries, they don't have any tolled road, for example. Salik in Dubai, it's government-based tolling. It's not public-private partnership. So road project, Bahrain is like everybody else. There is no tolling in Arab countries. I mean, there are probably some project in Morocco and Algeria.
What I was meaning was, do you anticipate that being introduced? So we have an existing road network or street lights network or, you know, something that already has been built, but you want to take it off the government balance sheet and get, you know, a developer to run it. Is that an option in Bahrain or something being considered? So PPPs without the big
we have done studies like kingdom-wide tolling strategy, but to implement such a strategy at the times of COVID-19, where the government is actually spending money to support small businesses and unemployed people, is not realistic at this time. But like most other countries, we've done tolling studies, but these studies are being shelved now, awaiting improvement in the economic conditions. Bahrain is one of the few countries, for example, didn't raise the VAT. I mean, other countries we're talking about a world that is overtaxed and you know, with lesser government revenues. Situation. Bahrain is no exception, and we're trying not to. The government didn't resort to increase the VAT, and at the same time they're taking more debt to support small businesses and people. So, and losing revenue at the same time. So this in terms of transport, but we have other projects. For example, water and electricity generation is a public-private partnership in Bahrain. Ad-Dur power plant is one of the biggest in the region. Sewage treatment plants are also public-private partnerships in Bahrain. Many social housing projects are on public-private partnerships in Bahrain. So, you know, our program is much advanced as probably we're next to Kuwait in terms of public-private partnerships, but. And we're doing okay, but the entire program is being re-examined at this moment. Okay. This is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Trevor, I said I wanted to come back to you with some of the questions on some of the points you mentioned. The first one I made a note of was about transferring demand risk. Now, demand risk, that requires some sort of information about demand, and in my understanding, often in the case of transport projects, that data doesn't exist. So how easy is it to sort of transfer demand risk to a private investor? Or do we have the actual building blocks to do? Sorry, Lloyd, that's a question for Trevor. If you could put your phone on mute.
I think the short answer is it's not easy. I mean, it is a huge challenge, and that comes back to the expectation and the realism point that I started with, which is yes, you can transfer some demand risk. The prospects of many transport projects within this region being entirely self-sufficient in funding terms, without some sort of government contribution is very slim, I'd have thought. So most deals will either have to be an entirely availability-based scheme, or some combination of availability and demand risk, and that's the spectrum I was talking about earlier. You've just got to find the right point. So on a greenfield project, a metro project, and whatever it might be, yes, people can do demand forecasts, but I think there's a lot of examples of demand forecasts being wrong rather than far more so than being right, and there have been a number of greenfield projects that have suffered enormously.
That's an interesting point, because the question here is on that. It relates to that point about demand forecast, but in the context of COVID. And the questioner is saying, with the impact of COVID, which could last in some sectors for several years, in the aviation sector, for example, does that mean a lot of the historical data that many models have been built on is now redundant? And what does that mean in contractual terms?
I mean, we're doing a huge amount of work in sort of a number of different markets where you've got sort of rail franchises and other demand-based structures, where those things are having to be looked at, with completely afresh, to understand what the implications are. And in some cases, it's the natural decrease in demand that flows from an event such as COVID-19. In other cases, it's the impact of legislation that's been brought in that sort of restricts movement and travel. So there's a huge number of different current matters that people are looking at on existing projects, but there's no doubt that some of them will be suffering very, very badly. They're not structured to provide appropriate protections.
Could that be a force majeure? I don't know when force majeure counts and when it doesn't, but if you can't deliver the service.
It's complicated, and there's no black and white sort of single answer that fits everything. But in general terms, something like a pandemic is considered to be, in this region, a natural force majeure, which will give time protection and performance relief, whereas a change in law that, for example, restricts travel would be considered political and therefore would provide some financial.
You want headphones?
So there is undoubtedly some protection available, but it's not blanket protection. And if you have a completely demand-based project there will be challenges, put it that way. Okay. But in terms of forecasting forward, I think it is people will today, on a project for today, taking Bahrain Metro as an example, will be having to look at what does that mean in terms of the return of demand for public transport? What does it mean in terms of ramp up? But also, what are the chances of an equivalent event happening at some point in the future? And lenders will be running all sorts of interesting sensitivities around the impact of something like that happening every 5 years, every 10 years, or whatever it might be. So the projects that are being prepared for market now will have to be prepared on a basis that's sufficiently robust to withstand future shocks of that kind.
Okay, thank you very much, Trevor. I'm going to, I think we've come to the end of our allocated time. I want to finish coming back to you, Loy, if I can, because you missed the beginning, so I want to give you the fair amount of time. But it sounds to me like COVID-19 has had a very, I mean, obviously it's had a devastating effect on everybody, but in Bahrain, which is, you know, trying to get itself back to investment and develop PPP, it sounds like the effect has been quite profound in terms of, you know, your focus has had to shift to IT projects or healthcare projects or water and wastewater projects. So what is your outlook, do you think, from a Ministry of Works point of view on the transport projects market in Bahrain, you know, the roads, ports, airports? Do you think really it's going to take quite a long time to get back to, you know, the priorities now moved away?
I wouldn't put it in terms of time, but let's first focus. COVID-19 is a demand crisis. It's not a financial crisis. So the finances for these projects is available. Now the issue is feasibility. Are these projects feasible from a government standpoint or not? Will the government be able to pay for them? And considering the reduced demand. So when we look at transport project, now the air traffic is reduced, seaboard movement, sea cargo is reduced. So many of these transport projects, they suffer from demand short-term, let's say, fall. Would this short-term fall continue in the future to become medium fall? This is, you know, a question to be answered. Would COVID-19 cause change in behaviors for people so that they stop using public transport systems, for example? These are questions that are being examined, but the government is cautiously proceeding by phasing. In other words, we're doing the essential projects now, and we're holding on expansions. Expansions will be done when needed, and as other risks or as other uncertainties are unveiled. So our strategy is proceed with caution for the moment until, you know, more information is available in terms of vaccines, in terms of people behaviors, in terms of the longevity of this crisis. It's a wise strategy. It's not the best in terms of construction costs, because phasing obviously increases construction costs, but it's the safest policy that the kingdom is pursuing at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer on that answer, and I think proceed with caution is probably a great summary statement for, you know, the outlook for transports across the region, and probably lots of other aspects as well. We've run out of time on this panel session, so I'm going to bring the session to a close. First, I'd like to thank all of you who have submitted questions. We've had a lot of questions, and thank you for your complimentary comments as well. Where we have not been able to answer your questions, I noticed there are a few on the Saudi projects, for example. We've not had a speaker in this panel for that. We will circulate your questions and try and get you some answers. But thank you very much for your participation. But more important than that, I want to thank the panelists. We've had a fantastic panel who have contributed openly and directly on this topic of transport PPPs. So to Morgan Belsher, Trevor Butcher, Munir Farouzi, and Engineer Loy Ghazali, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise. It's really been valuable, and I look forward to working with you again. So thank you, gentlemen, for your work today.